So here's the question though. Are there meaningful differences across SES in this part of the input, that is the WH dependencies and the syntactic trigrams that are sort of the foundation for learning under this learning strategy? And so the first thing we want to ask is, well, what are the differences? How different does this input part look across SES? And that's something we can measure. We can measure the distribution of the relevant parts, the WH dependencies, and the syntactic trigram building blocks. One way to do this is to use something called the Jensen-Shannon divergence, JSDiv in our case for short, and it ranges between 0 and 1. And 0 means you have just identical distributions, while 1 means you have pretty dissimilar distributions, or like as dissimilar as possible. And so to look at samples of input, we took high SES child-directed speech from the child's tree bank, which was about 102,000 utterances, about 21,000 WH dependencies, again the relevant part for our purposes. And this was speech directed at 25 high SES children between the ages of 1 and 5. Our low SES sample also comes from the childish tree bank, which is a subpart of this HSLLD corpus. And it's about 32,000 utterances, but again, our purposes were focusing on the WH dependencies, about 3.9 thousand of those. And this is speech directed at 78 low SES children between the ages of 3 and 5. And then, in case you're wondering, in this case, for the purposes of this corpus, for the people who compiled it, SES was defined by maternal education. In this case, the mothers had 6 years to some post-high school education, and annual income, which at the time this corpus was collected, 70% reported making less than 20K a year. And these were the indices that they used to gauge lower SES background, because again, there are lots of different things that you can use, but these are the ones that they use. And maternal education is often, I think, a very good marker for this kind of thing. And just for comparison, you'll see why we need to do this in a moment, we also just took a sample of high SES adult-directed speech from the switchboard corpus of adults speaking to each other over the phone, about 75,000 utterances, but again, the part we care about is the dependencies, about 8,500 WH dependencies. And this is what we compared, right? What do we find? Like, how different are these from each other, and what does it mean? In particular, something that we can ask when we have these samples to look at is high SES child-directed speech more like low SES child-directed speech, or is high SES child-directed speech more like high SES adult-directed speech, right? So this is asking in some sense what factor matters more, the fact that you're talking to children or the fact that you're having a conversation within the same SES strata. Right? So if high SES child-directed speech is more like low SES child-directed speech than it is to high SES adult, then this tells us that SES differences matter less than who the speech is directed at, child versus adult. But if we get the opposite finding, then that means that SES differences matter more than who the speech is directed at. So this is in some way just to get a sense of what aspect, right, of these interactions matters more, the SES stratum or whether it's child versus adult directed. And what we find is whether we look at WH dependencies or syntactic trigrams, we find the same pattern. High SES and low SES child-directed speech are much more similar than high SES and child-directed versus high SES adult-directed, right? So for WH dependencies, these are the numbers that we get. You can think about this as, this is, again, a value between 0 and 1, so this is in some sense, twice as similar compared to that, because higher is worse. And the same thing is true for syntactic trigrams. Again, approximately like the number is twice as much for comparing child versus adult, so it's twice as close. And the takeaway again is that if you're looking across SES, what matters more is not the fact that it's differing SES. What matters more is who you're talking to. So in that sense, this part of the input looks pretty similar, right, under this view, certainly more similar than child-directed versus adult-directed within the same SES stratum. But again, okay, that's nice, right? This is just a quantitative way to describe the input differences and get a sense of, at least in this comparative approach, that these are more similar, right, than these are to each other. But the question then is, does this part of the input act differently across SES? That is, are any differences, even if they're smaller, developmentally meaningful, right? They might be, because small differences in the input distribution might snowball into a learning outcome difference, right? And so if we look at the WH dependencies, we look at, say, the top 2 most frequent WH dependencies, like 3/4 of them are these main clause objects. What did Lily read? About 10 to 12% of them are main clause subject. What happened? I mean, that's like the bulk of your input right there, right? It's like, 86%, 87%, 88%, right? And the rest of it is all distributed across the other WH dependencies. But, they're all teeny differences, right? If you look at the syntactic trigrams, you see pretty similar distributions looking at the top 3, which basically make up your main clause object and your main clause subject dependency. You can see the percentages that they make up are, pretty similar, but again, are some differences. So, okay, here's something we know. We already have some evidence from de Villiers et al. 2008 that low SES children also, like high SES children, disprefer WH dependencies that cross complex NP islands, one of the islands we're looking at, right? So in that sense, we don't see an outcome difference with respect to complex NP islands. So at least for complex NP islands, if our learning theory is right, if this way of learning is reasonable and valid, and is doing the right thing, it's a checkpoint, we shouldn't predict learning outcome differences across SES by age 4, no matter what's going on in the input. The input differences shouldn't be developmentally meaningful for this island type, right? So we can check that one. And then we can ask, well, what about the other 3 island types, the subject, the weather, and the adjunct? What do we predict for that knowledge at 4 years old? Or any input difference is predicted to be developmentally meaningful for these islands, right? Maybe some are, maybe some aren't. And so what we can use is developmental computational modeling to find